Good morning, everyone, and welcome to DigiShift 48. Today, we're delighted to have Lesley Pinder with us from British Red Cross. She'll be talking about supporter experience, and once she's kicked off, there'll be lots of time for a question and discussion. So thanks, Lesley, for joining us, and over to you.
Hi, everybody. This is exciting. It's nice to speak to a whole lot of folk in Scotland, or near Scotland. So yeah, as John said, I'm Lesley. I'm the head of supporter experience at the British Red Cross. So I'm going to chat a bit about what we mean by support experience and what my experience has been in kind of setting up a team that looks after supporter experience in a very gigantic organisation, but with massive appreciation that what we've done at the Red Cross, I would think, is applicable anywhere. It's just maybe how you do it might be slightly different when you're not at an organisation like the Red Cross. So I'll chat a bit about that and what our story's been, and then any questions, and then hopefully like more of a conversation with you all about experience and what it means to you and what you've done in your organisations, because it'd be amazing to hear from all of you as well about your learnings around supporter experience. So I'll start at the very beginning. I joined the Red Cross, Lord, 3 and a bit years ago, 2018 it was. And the job was advertised as head of supporter experience, Maze. And I'd been working as a fundraising innovation consultant for a company called Good Innovation for a couple of years. And prior to that, kind of a jack of all trades fundraiser. So I'd done a bit of everything, a bit of innovation, some community fundraising, individual giving, major donors, corporates, everything. Prior to that, I worked in Scotland doing sort of arts management, running sort of music projects. Jen, I recognise you from the Arts Council as it was then. So I used to run a music project, and I think Jen was like you were one of our funders, I think. Anyway, so a bit of a jack of all trades person. And one of the things working in an innovation consultancy that we did was go out and speak to supporters of charities a lot. Lots and lots and lots of different charities about lots of different things. But we always used to ask a question, which I love, and I still ask, which is, can you tell us about a time where a charity has totally delighted you? And I would say 90% of the time, the people we spoke to couldn't think of one. And this was charities they supported, whose values they deeply cared about, or an issue that was close to their hearts because they'd had a personal experience. And yet still, it felt like we were kind of consistently disappointing people, which is like, no bueno. And when they could think of one, it was usually a local organisation who had remembered their name, who'd treated them really well, or who had looked after one of their family members really well. They would be very quick to think of all the things charities had done to annoy them. And so when a job like head of support experience came up, I was like, this is an opportunity to try and fix that, I suppose. And it being at the British Red Cross, who at that time had just, I guess we'd just gone through the 2015 I want to say scandals around fundraising, where there was a lot of press coverage about fundraising practices, and the charity sector, and I think fundraisers, had got quite defensive, as if they were being attacked unreasonably for their behaviour, which I think to some extent they were, because Daily Mail, but also to some extent I actually think some of the criticisms that fundraising was getting at that point was actually quite valid, because our supporters had been telling us for years that they didn't like the way that we were communicating with them, but we still kept doing it anyway. So the British Red Cross, I was like, cool, they're like really caring about supporter experience here, and they've created a new role. This is a really good opportunity. So the role when I joined was in individual giving. So, and quite quickly when I joined, I realised that what they meant by supporter experience wasn't quite the same as what I thought. And so I'll chat a little bit about what that was. But basically, in fact, I'll share some slides. I do have some slides, mainly to keep me on track, because I get overexcited when I'm talking about supporter experience and just bang on about it with no structure, which is no good for anybody. Basically, when I joined, it became very clear that they thought supporter experience was retention. So I don't know how many of you guys here are fundraisers directly or at least work in fundraising, but if it's not fundraising, it could be any. So basically, it's about loyalty. It's about keeping donors and getting them to give more. That was basically what the understanding of experience was when I joined. It was a fancy way of saying donor retention. And that's not what supporter experience is. And it's not about driving loyalty. That could be the end result of focusing on supporter experience. But if your starting point is loyalty, then you're not thinking about the supporter's experience. You're thinking about what you want from them. And it also isn't journeys. So another thing that in my team, I was the head of supporter experience, and the structure of the team had been created before I started. And under me was a supporter journey manager. And very quickly, I changed her job title to supporter experience manager. Journeys are one of the things that people talk about a lot when it comes to supporter experience, as if they are one and the same thing. So a supporter journey is like, okay, somebody joins, they make a donation. This is the journey we're going to design for them. That journey that you create for them, obviously is part of their experience, but it is not the whole experience. And just focusing on journeys, again, is focusing on what do we want those people to do, as opposed to what do they need from us. And how are we meeting their expectations and needs? So I very quickly realized, like, by being within individual giving as well, I was limited within one very small type of giving. And so there was a good 6 months of me going, this isn't experience, guys, which is challenging. And then we had a new chief supporter officer, Paul O'Madi, join, and his job title to be a chief supporter officer was about all supporters. And he moved my team to becoming a central team. And the reason for that is because, wow, this slide's a lot. Sorry, that's really red. I didn't realize quite how red that was. Basically what I define supporter experience, and what we now define supporter experience at the Red Cross is, it is the experience our supporters have. And it's a combination of every interaction they have with the British Red Cross and how it makes them feel. That's what supporter experience is. It's what customer experience is, if you're thinking about it from a commercial perspective, or customer across a whole organization could also include the people who are using your services, who are coming to you for information. And if that is our definition of experience, it means it has to be beyond giving types from a fundraising perspective. It can't just be about face-to-face. It can't just be about telephone fundraising. It has to be about every interaction that somebody has with you, which makes it massive and slightly terrifying, I'm not going to lie. But this is based on kind of how people approach experience in the commercial sector and where it works really well. And so this is the approach that we take at the Red Cross. And like I say, it's not just a fundraising experience, or if you're working in service delivery, it's not just a service delivery experience. The experience somebody has of the British Red Cross is impacted by every element of the Red Cross. So one of the first things I did when I joined was ask our data team to do a crossover analysis. So we're in the wonderful position where we have fundraising donors on one database, retail customers who have gift aid declarations and loyalty cards on another database, volunteers on a completely different database, fun times, our email program on a completely different. So actually to do that piece of work, a crossover analysis actually took a good couple of months. But basically what we found was we do, of course, have donors who are also volunteers and who are also charity shop customers and who are also staff. And we will also have, through our research that we do, we know we also have donors who are donors to us because they've used our services in the past, or somebody they know has, or they're giving to us to say thank you for the help we gave somebody in their community. So the experience they have isn't just a fundraising experience, it is the experience of the British Red Cross and who we are as a whole. Now, my job and my remit is in fundraising. And so influencing a whole organization-wide experience strategy is kind of outside of my remit, but also I kind of can't separate myself from it. But really, over the last 3 years, we've been focusing primarily on the fundraising experience to make it better. What's the next one? Yeah, okay. This was a theory that I held and hold dearly and have held dearly in my heart ever since I started this job and before, which is if you give people a positive experience, that meets their expectations and their needs, they are more likely to give again and to advocate for us. The challenge I had when I first joined was there was no evidence in the charity sector. And by evidence, I mean like the way that a lot of people like evidence in the charity sector, which is like massive benchmarking programs and like big pieces of data, as opposed to vast numbers of stories from fundraisers who know that this is true. There wasn't any evidence for this when I first joined. And that actually did make it quite challenging, because I was pushed back on, cool, yeah, great, but supporters say one thing, but we know that our results are better if we add 25 incentives into a mailing pack. So what's been one of the biggest challenges over the last 2 to 3 years is getting to a point where we can kind of prove this. And I would say we're about 70% of the way there, of proving that if you focus on experience first, then and give people a good experience, they're more likely to give again and to advocate for us. We've done that by kind of starting to consistently ask questions of our donors about how they're feeling about us, and then matching how they feel about us with how likely they are to give again. What we haven't managed to get right yet is we can't match experience scorings and satisfaction and all that stuff back to their giving data yet. So actually, to be honest, I think as a sector, we need to get comfortable with the fact that the world is a lot less easy to just define in a linear way, like we did X thing and therefore Y income went up. It's actually really hard. But we've seen in projects that we've run that when you start with what the supporter needs and you map out their interactions and you purposely design the experience that they are going to have at every single touch point, then the response rates are much more positive. Also, you're working more effectively and efficiently because you're not wasting time on stuff that donors don't want and need. And we're also finding that basically donors are saying much more positive things about the Red Cross than when I first started, which sounds a bit vague, but is actually genuinely really important. Metrics are great, but actually how people feel and measuring that is super important as well. If that makes sense. What's the next one say? Oh, right, yeah. Your donors are having, like your customers or your supporters or whoever it is that you're reaching out to, they are having an experience with you, whether you plan it or not. And a good experience doesn't happen by accident. And in fact, I would say that if you're not thinking about experience and about the supporter or customer experience that you're trying to deliver, I would probably say more often than not, that means the experience isn't going to be great, or at least it's not going to be as good as you can. So it has to be thought about, and you can't just say it. And I think one of the problems we found was just saying we're thinking about supporter experience, lovely, but the actual work that needs to be done to make it happen every day at every point is actually a lot harder than it sounds, especially in a big organization like the Red Cross. This is where actually I think if you're in a smaller organization where you all work more closely together, I'd say it's probably easier to embed like thinking through a supporter's experience end to end. For us to think through a supporter's experience end to end, I have to bring in people from about 10 different teams, and it gets really complicated, and there's so many different data rules, and it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen by accident. So you have to really force it in to people's thinking to start with. We went through a combination basically of kind of carrot, just like trying to demonstrate to people why it was good to think about supporter experience, and sort of going through a process of like convincing it's really important, you should do it, showing people by like running projects ourselves where we were improving experience. And now we're in the phase of it's built into our fundraising strategy and it's built into other team strategic plans. And now we're building it into their ways of working and planning so that the supporter experience is thought about and talked about, even if me and my team aren't in the room. But it's taken 3 years to get there. It's taken a long time for us to get to the point where most teams, if not all, are thinking and planning and considering what experience they want to be giving people without my team constantly being there going, have we thought about the supporter, guys? Which was basically all I've said for the last 2.5, 3 years. So it's nice to not be needed anymore, I think. And it's everyone's job. Support experience is everyone's job. So it's our fundraising operations team who run our supporter care team. Like that, the interaction they have with a supporter is probably one of the most obvious interactions that can make a difference to somebody's experience. But it's also how the donation page is designed. It's what the thank you email says. It's whether what the information and updates you're giving donors after they donate match what you told them they were going to be giving to when you launched your gigantic big appeal. So often our focus was on acquisition and getting people in the door. And as soon as they were in the door, we just kind of stopped thinking about it after that. And we put so much care and effort into creating amazing appeals. And then as soon as somebody put their hand in the pocket and were like, I believe in you, we just kind of took that for granted that it would last forever. So support experience has to be everybody's job. So that's how we and I view support experience at the British Red Cross. And we worked with a customer experience consultancy to help us get to this place. So I do think the principles that we follow kind of apply to everything. It sounds simple, like, oh, cool. Support experience is like every interaction everybody has. And you just need to think about it. It is very simple, but it's not simple either, because you start to quickly realize that the way in which your organizations are set up are not designed to, or at least for us anyway, it wasn't designed to think about the experience of the donor. It was designed to drive behaviors we wanted donors to take and make for us. So the way our data is designed is all around the marketing channels. The way that we plan campaigns, it starts with the media plan first. The way that our teams interact are all siloed, rather than seeing the journey that supporters can take through all the different ways and that we ask people to support us. Like, it's really hard to see if this donor over here who started giving us 10 quid a month also works for one of our corporate partners, but is also a volunteer. It's really hard for us to see the 360 view of our donors, because the way that we measured success was on how well our campaign, a particular appeal or a particular channel performed. All of that's changing for us now. So like I said, delivering a great supporter experience is now an integral part of our new strategy. It's therefore built into our performance management, so we have to report against it. All of those things are super important, and without them, it will literally just be one person or a team like me banging on about supporter experience, but nothing actually changing. So it's simple, but it's actually not simple. So that's, I hope that's helpful. That's kind of like a whistle-stop tour of how we think about it. I don't know if it would be helpful for me to chat about what we actually do, or whether we want to dive into some questions, and that might end us up in that place. Anyway, does that make sense?
Thanks, Lesley. That's really great. And we are starting to see a few good questions popping in. I wonder if one thing maybe if you might be willing, just before we widen out to questions, is like if there's an example of like a channel or a particular piece of what you've been doing where you've kind of changed things around a bit, just to kind of put it a bit more concretely for folk.
Yeah, it is a bit theory. So it's massive support experience. So we chunked it up into 4 key things that we think are really important. First is like vision. So that means being super clear about what a good experience should feel like for our supporters. So it's like, what kind of experience do you want to deliver? So we've created what we call a North Star. Everyone's got North Stars for various different things. I need to find a different name. But anyway, the North Star is basically what are our brand values, which are compassion, inclusivity, courageousness, and something else, which I should know. So it's like if they are who we are as the Red Cross, therefore our experience should reflect who we are. That's ultimately what your experience is. It's your brand in action. It's like who you are in action. So we have that, which basically says like, what does it mean to give our supporters a courageous experience, or dynamic experience, an inclusive experience? But then we also have 5 needs that we know our donors have from us. And so that means that when people are designing experiences, they can think about how are we meeting these people's needs. So that was one of the first concrete things we did, which was say, what is a Red Cross experience and what needs do we need to meet? So the needs we have are things like people want to feel hopeful, and they need to feel confident in the Red Cross that we're going to do what we say we are. And that's one of the things, people do trust us a lot, which is great. And so there's 5 of those. So that was one of the first concrete things. And then we did sessions with every team in fundraising to say, like, in your world, so in corporate partnerships or in volunteer fundraising, like, what does this look like for you? And made them decide how they would apply that into their world. And then we have culture, which is like making sure that sport experience is valued and measured and is something that people think is important. So a lot of that was just basically like propaganda to start with. But we also do a thing called Supporter Celebration Week, which I know a lot of organizations do now, which is basically we do some internal engagement, sharing stories about who our donors are and our supporters beyond the major donors who, like, we talk about a lot, like, hey, Land Rover gave us 3 million. I'm like, hey, this person over here gives us 10 quid a month. Like, that's just as important. So we talk about that. And we also do a thankathon where we phone up donors and say, hey, thanks for being amazing. So they're like the more internally focused things. But then we do design projects, which is basically identifying either audiences or experiences that are problematic or that could be better and fixing them. And so one of the first ones we looked at was our emergency appeal experience. So that's a classic example of where so much energy and effort is put into the run-up of designing an emergency appeal, launching the emergency appeal, marketing the emergency appeal, and then nothing. There was no designed experience for donors after they gave to the Red Cross in an emergency. And considering we're one of the biggest emergency appeal charities, that kind of slightly blew my tiny mind. So we worked with the supporter marketing engagement team, our individual giving team, and an external email expert, because we knew email was the biggest tool we had. Raleigh, Paul de Gregorio, who I know has spoken to you guys before. We had PDG come in and help us understand best practice around email, and my team went off and did a whole load of research with emergency donors to understand like why they gave to us, what their experience was like, what they needed, and then combining that supporter insight and the sort of practical best ways of using email. We designed an email experience for emergency donors, and that kind of became a blueprint for our individual giving team last year through COVID, where I think we launched like 7 emergency appeals last year. It was bananas, but because they had that framework of best email practice, how best to meet supporters' needs, they could design every single email, not just the journey, but every single email was designed to meet one of those supporters' needs, and also use the best practice that Paul had given around like one email, one ask, one topic, no more email newsletters with like 89 boxes, really clear subject lines, speaking very from the heart, being very human. So that was an example of a project where we applied sort of the principles in practice. And then they were also expanded. Amy and Individual Giving did the same for our cash program, which was gigantic. So we're starting to apply it in different places. And I'm running a project just now for major donors, which is one of our major donor giving clubs, and it's understanding how the experience feels to the members of that giving club and then redesigning the experience with them. It's the first time we've ever co-created with major donors, and it's actually slightly terrifying, but so powerful to give ownership to these amazing women and allowing them to tell us what they need from us, rather than pretending we need to know all the answers and that we are like the experts to give unto them. So yeah, so that's, I guess, a practical example. I think one of the things I'd say is when I first joined, I think this whole concept of being human-centered and insight, like person-centered, was very like, we were kind of a square peg in a round hole, but very quickly the Red Cross has moved to our whole corporate strategies around being community-centered and person-centered. So the language around designing with people and co-creating has become a lot more commonplace, which helps. Otherwise, it would still be like banging your head against a wall a little bit. Does that help? I hope that helps.
Yeah.
I'd love to know what other folk have done in this space.
Yeah, Jane's got a question about what kind of tools you use. So you talked about the small group, kind of focus group type stuff there. Are there any other tools or practices you use to gather that insight from supporters and donors?
Yeah, so again, this is one of these things where I have to really acknowledge the privileged position I'm in having I have a team of 5 at the Red Cross, and we just look at supporter experience. But we have a fundraising directorate of, I think, I want to say about 130 or 140 staff. So it's massive. Then we have retail, and we do also work with the retail team as well. So very privileged that I have an insight experience manager in my team and a research and reporting lead that works with her. And so they help us design and deliver a lot of our supporter research. For the emergency project, we did one-to-one interviews with emergency donors and a survey. So we started with the survey, which is quant, so we could send it to lots of people, get quite broad kind of brush feedback. But we always ask for open text, which is always fun. You get like 10,000 responses. We didn't in that project, thank God. And that helped us hone in on some themes, and then we followed up with one-to-one interviews. So we try and do one-to-one interviews or 1 to 2 interviews as much as possible to really understand people. So yeah, and then we also have more, so that's the kind of qual side, but we also have a more measurements side where we will send emails, email surveys to our donors kind of last year we did it every 3 months, which sounds a lot, but during COVID it was really important. And in those emails, we start with asking them how they are in life and like how their world is. Then we'll ask them about the experience of giving to us and how we're doing. And then we'll usually ask them something about whatever happens to be quite relevant at the time. So I don't know, so like last September, we were about to launch an appeal to support the COVID response internationally. And we were like, are our supporters ready for that when they're having a horrid time themselves? And so we asked them, we were like, how would you feel if we were to launch an international appeal? And they came back and said, we totally understand that we would expect you to do that. You're the Red Cross, it's what you do. I might not support it, but I would be surprised if you didn't ask me to support it. So we were like, cool. And that meant we could go out quite confidently to our supporters and not feel like we were going to alienate them. So we have quite a rolling, constantly asking questions of our donors about how they are and stuff, and not always just about the Red Cross, because that's self.
Cool. So I'm going to just take chair's privilege and jump in with a wee question here, which is I think about smaller charities. So I think a strength that smaller organizations often have is they got direct access to supporter experience because everybody's in the same office or they just directly know the people involved. But I think that can make a problem of kind of anecdata. So you're like, well, so and so, you know, there's Mary, she's always in touch with us and we know what she thinks. Therefore we know what all our supporters think. And actually you often find that it's quite a small group of very committed folk that can skew your perception of what people are really into. And I wondered if you had any ideas about how you might navigate that.
Yes. And that applies in a big organization like ours as well. And that's actually, that's been one of the things that we heard a lot in the relationship fundraising land. So like community fundraising, where they have one-to-one relationships, or philanthropy, or even corporate partnerships, we're like, yeah, but we know what our donors, like we know our donors because we speak to them all the time. And I think that's great. And obviously you do know people one-to-one, but I think what we found was like, yeah, absolutely. You're either skewing it because you think you know all your donors because you know some of them, or you think every single donor is completely unique and you create everything for, like, you have to do everything special for every one human, where actually there are kind of groups of types of people that you can group, and we would typically group them in motivation. So like, what's their motivation to be supporting us? And in things like community fundraising, like what's their time? How much time have they got? What's their social currency that we call it? So like, are they all about their networks and their pals? Or are they more about, I'm gonna go off and raise the money and give you the money? And that kind of stuff helps you start to group supporters into kind of groups, and you can you can quite easily, if you have those kind of personas, be like, oh, this person's one of those types of people. Cool. Like, I know that those types of people will like this sort of thing. So you can start to create like almost like a menu of options for donors. But to do that, it's really, I think the advice I always give folk is to get together all of your fundraisers, or even if it's just a couple of you, and start doing what we would call like an empathy map. So like, what do your donors care about and think about? And what do you think their motivations are? What do you think they want to do for you? And then write up the assumptions you've made about who your supporters are and what they care about, and create some questions off the back of those that you can then just speak to them and ask them. It's a bit controversial.
Yeah.
And it is something that people think you have to be a research specialist to do interviews with your donor. I'm not a research specialist. Like, I'm not a researcher. Sharon in my team is. And when it comes to big, massive surveys with 10,000 responses, like, don't put those anywhere near me. But a phone call with a donor asking them, hey, like, I'd love to know a bit more about why you chose to give to us. I'd love to get to know you and your life a bit better. Like, anyone can do that. The key is about listening to them. And I think when people say, oh, I speak to my donors every day, actually what they mean is they're telling their donors stuff every day. They're not listening to their donors.
Yeah.
But I totally agree. Like, there is a danger of either thinking everybody's unique or that everybody's like that one person.
Yeah. And just tying it back to another observation from Jane, and I might ask this out to the room, is the experience of working with boards. Because I've had experience with a board where, because they're like the super committed advocates who are like really, really into the organization, and they find it quite hard to think, well, what might a new member be thinking as they're just joining, or what might somebody who's only really been with us for a month or two think like. So I wonder if other people have had that experience of kind of like putting a plan to a board or talking to a board about supporter strategies and how that's been. You can type in chat if you want to, it's fine.
Yeah, it'd be good to know if this kind of resonates with any of you, like trying to convince people of the importance of thinking about the person and the people first. If that's something that people have dealt with.
I'll give you maybe another question to ponder while we're doing that is, have you done anything new? Anyone in the room done anything new in terms of being in touch with your supporters in the last year, and how has that gone?
I can chat a little bit about the board stuff. Oh, sorry, carry on. No, carry on. I will not talk. Somebody else is going to.
I can say something from a small charity perspective.
Go for it.
Helpful. So I have actually just moved organisations. So I went from Music in Hospitals and Care. I just realised how ridiculous I look. I've cold and I'm in a cupboard. And I've just moved to Cerebral Palsy Scotland. So Music in Hospitals and Care was a small number of people in the database, shall we say, but no, we'd never done an appeal, we'd never done a newsletter, we didn't have direct debit set up, so really small. So from that, what we did have though was a friends scheme, and because that existed already, and having looked at it, it didn't make sense to scrap that. And whether I would have picked it from scratch, I'm not sure. But it was operating differently in each country. So each Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland were operating it completely differently. So we did bring that together, and just small steps to start it off with newsletters. So telling people what we were doing. So simple stuff to tell people what impact anything that they were giving was having before we then asked for money. And that came at the point of COVID. As it happens, we would have been doing that anyway, but at that point it was an emergency appeal. And then we used that on the back of that. And just before I'd left, I'd set up our first sort of more multidisciplinary appeal, if you like, but trying to consider how we did involve the supporters at every point with, as best we could, doing Zoom calls with a cross reference of supporters to ask them how they felt about the changes that were coming. But prior to that, we'd ask them what they thought that we could do better in lots of different ways. And actually they were quite receptive. And I find myself in a similar position where I've just moved to, where I'll need to kind of do all that again, but with a slightly smaller again group. So that will be interesting. And we'll see how that goes.
Thanks, Sarah. That's really interesting. And I guess interesting that there's often those kind of tried and tested things that are there. Sometimes you need to build on them, but sometimes you maybe need to ask about them and say, is this still the right thing? Is there anybody else who's at the stage of just trying to get stuff going to begin with? Okay, and Jennifer, as if Funky has talked, don't know, Jennifer, you want to say any more about the organisation you're working with or just getting started?
Yeah, so actually really interesting. It's a festival called Durdishy, and they work with Arab and North African women and gender minorities, promoting their work in art, programs and stuff like that. So they run a festival this year. They've been online, obviously, because of COVID, but actually the director has been running as a sole trader. So they've brought me in as a fundraiser and to help with that organisational development. And we're just going through the board recruitment just now, and actually but they've got an international following. And I think there's a real opportunity for them to tap into this right at this point, and to embed what Lesley's been saying, like into that board culture at this point. So this is massively useful for me, and I know Samir is so busy thinking about the programme and the delivery and everything she's had to deal with this last year, because she's actually been delivering this for 3 years solo and only just brought into me and a marketing person. So yeah, this is really exciting actually. So thank you.
Cool, great. And really inspiring to hear about that thinking happening right at the start, when it can really shape the way the organisation does stuff, because I think some of us will have experience of it being bolted on later.
Yeah.
Any other questions at all on the nuts and bolts side, or have people got more questions about getting things started and maybe improving things as they go along? We could do a straw poll and see, is anybody working for an organisation that does not have a kind of planned supporter program in place right now, or has everybody got something that they're looking at kind of tweaking or reviewing?
That's good.
Yeah, go for it, Karen.
So I work for a UK organisation, and I'm in the Scotland office. And we deal with debt, which is a devolved issue. So things are different in Scotland than they are in England. So I'd love to hear if there's anything that you do kind of comms wise, I guess, that's looking at the different contexts and how you manage that as an organisation, and any tips, I guess, for helping colleagues in our head office in England to understand the differences in Scotland and take them into consideration in kind of planning, I guess, those comms.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, and I have to say, I think it's something that we're really bad at. I definitely think we fall into the trap in our London office, who do all of our fundraising comms, of thinking everything's the same everywhere. I certainly think during COVID, because of all, it's not been good, obviously, it's been awful, but the fact that all the devolved nations have often had different stages in the journey has actually been a really good wake-up call for our central fundraising team, because they would write emails about, oh, hey, it must be really difficult for you right now because all the rules have just changed. And then we'd get an email back from a Scottish donor going, no, they've not. And we'd be like, oh, shit. And that happened once, and then we never did it again, just to be super clear. Yeah, I think that's really valid. I think I always fall back on basically saying, like, start with the people you're creating for. And if you're going to be doing any kind of research into the people that you're engaging, whether service users or donors, if you believe that there are differences between folk in England and Scotland, or folk in cities and rural areas, or whatever the difference is to build that in and go out and check whether that's true by speaking to people and understanding the context and using their feedback and stories to demonstrate to the folk in London why and how it's different. Because yeah, I think I used to work at Breast Cancer Now, and we had a Scottish office, and it was the same conversation there, and I think it's probably still the same conversation there, to be honest. And I think it is because folk just think it's teams talking about it, whereas if you can bring the supporter or the audience to life and say, look, this is a persona that is different to your persona, please can you keep both of these in mind, or create completely different things. I always go back to, like, start with the audience and what they need and want. There may be some similarities, there may be some differences. And I'd say the same for the board thing as well. Like, if the board are struggling to get their heads around it, sharing real life examples of what the actual experience feels like for a donor. If they think it's all shiny and wonderful, being like, okay, this is a person, this is the journey they've gone through by supporting the Red Cross. Do you think this is good enough? Is usually quite good at making them go, huh.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we have is data, because we have a smaller audience in comparison to the English audience. Whenever data or whenever research is done across the UK, it's not necessarily reflective of the Scottish audience then as well. So I guess that's a challenge in kind of helping our head office colleagues to understand the importance of the difference here.
Yeah, and I think it should be like any kind of inclusivity. Like, you can't exclude certain audiences. But you can't just assume because there's less of a certain group of folk that they're less important. That would be the same in any kind of group of people. So when we've been doing a huge amount of work on self-reflection and stuff, and realizing that the way in which we did supporter research was massively problematic, because we were basing our segments on value or socioeconomic group. Totally comfortable if the mix of people were reflective of the national breakdown, whether that's Scottish or ethnic minority or whether it's around like LGBT, and actually realizing that you have to proactively recruit more people from those groups to ensure that their voices are heard. And I think that if you have any kind of inclusivity policies or programs, then I would say one good place to start influencing would be there, because this is as much of an include, like, you can't exclude because they're less of Scottish folk. So it's really, yeah, I don't know, that would be the way I would think about it. It's not, yeah, it's interesting.
A quick thought I was going to chip in there is a good strategy sometimes, if you've got some very loyal or high value Scottish supporters, if you can keep in touch with them and bring their voices in, that could be really helpful, because that can sometimes give non-Scottish team members a bit of reality check, because you've then got a real person who's saying, right, quite clearly, right, this doesn't match my experience or my context. That can be helpful.
Yeah.
One quick question I was going to fire in was about finding this balance between doing enough research to make sure you're doing the right thing, but not getting totally stuck in the research. I think a lot of smaller organizations, if you were to say, right, we're going to go and research and plan for 18 months and then do something, they would go, we can't do that because we need to do something really quickly. But also, you don't want to just jump in and do stuff without a sensible basis behind it.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear how the book approach that. It's hard. So I'm going to give a pitch to a book that I love, that I tell everyone to read. It's called Just Enough Research. So perfect title, by a woman called Erica Hall. She's a designer in the sense of designs things as opposed to graphic designer. Like, I think we're all designers in some way. But anyway, so she is in America. It's hard to get a printed copy of it, but you can download an ebook version of it. And her whole thing, which is the way I live my life now when it comes to research, is what information do we need to make a good decision? And how much information is enough information to make a good decision? And what research do we need to do to gather that information? Because I think folk think of supporter insight and research of like, I need to go out and do a massive big qual piece of research or send a survey to 1 million people. Whereas if you start with what do we need to know, more often than not, you've probably got a lot of that information already. Or there's sector research that you could go and read, or and also it's not to forget that your own professional knowledge and that of your peers is still knowledge. Like you don't always have to assume you don't know anything. Like sometimes you do know stuff, and that's groovy. So that's her whole thing, is start with what you need to know and then design the research appropriately to that thing. But also just be comfortable that at some point you're going to be like, we can't do any more research. This is as much as we can do. We need to move on to making decisions. But we think we've got enough knowledge right now to make that decision and move forward. I actually have a recording Q&A that I did with her for the Institute of Fundraising conference, but I could share it with you guys.
Wow.
Don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
Anyway, I recorded it till my Zoom. So
Yeah.
so I'll maybe wait until IWF conference is like over and stuff. It's literally happening right now. It would be a bit cheeky, but like maybe in a couple of weeks I'll share it with you. Not because it's me, just because it's Erica talking about that whole fear of too much knowledge, not enough knowledge. Like, and her thing is like, we research everything. We are all researchers. If you go on holiday, you research which Greek island you want to go to. You research which airport. Like, we're all researchers, and I think it's just about matching the research you do with the problem you've got, so you don't end up doing way more research than you actually need. And also getting comfortable. As a sector, we're obsessed with data, and like we have to have a 2-year longitudinal control group study to decide whether changing that one mailing is going to like destroy our whole mailing program. Like that was literally the way that things were. Like everything was so controlled, and then last year everything got ripped up, almost quite literally, and we just made some changes and it was fine. Like nothing blew up and died, and it's okay to not know everything. You guys have had folk come and talk about service design and stuff with you, so like you'll have heard like just start with one thing and do an experiment and learn. Like if you can't do lots of research, then research by doing as well would be another thing. Not everybody has a Sharon and Megan in their team like I do, but even I've gone out and done 10 interviews with some supporters and be like, okay, that gives me enough to make a slightly more informed decision. That's better than I was at before. Cool.
Yeah. And that sounds really interesting, Lesley. That I value the small but often pieces of research, because you're talking, I think, earlier about doing a quick short survey to get a few pieces of insight.
Yeah, man.
Because it feels like if the context is changing, you want to be doing that rather than waiting a long time, asking a lot of questions.
Man, we have a philosophy of little and often, definitely when it comes to surveys.
Yeah.
We do like pop-up surveys at donation point.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have an insight team, these are two things I would do. Here's a tip. There's a thing called Hotjar, which I think you can get free access to, which means you can add a little pop-up survey on your website after people have made a donation, not before. Like it doesn't break up the donation process. So they've made their donation, we got a little survey. We ask 3 questions. One is, how easy was it for you to make your donation? What made you choose to give a donation today? And then what one question would you have for us about the Red Cross, or if it's a specific appeal, the Afghanistan emergency appeal? Those 3 questions give you so much wealth and depth. So it tells you, is our donation process easy peasy lemon squeezy? And I know obviously conversion rates will tell you that a bit too, but it's nice to hear it. Motivation is super important. It helps you understand what drives people to give, and that'll help with future campaigns. And then third, what one question do they have? Helps you design the ongoing comms that you can send them to say thank you. So for the Afghanistan appeal, we had that up, and the one big question people asked us was, how are you making sure that help gets to people on the ground and isn't lost in translation? So great. That meant the comms team could write an email straight away saying, hey, this is how we work with the Afghanistan Red Cross. And we create some Instagram and Twitter and Facebook scorely things that talked about how the Red Cross works internationally and how our money gets on the ground. Those things took about 5 minutes because we know the answer, whereas previously we might have sat and navel gazed for about 6 months about what is it our donors want to hear. Just ask them. And similarly, send your supporters a survey that maybe has 4 or 5 questions that says something like, hey, we'd love to know how you're feeling right now. It made sense during COVID, so we always ask donors, how are you doing? Are you all right? And then we ask them, how would you rate your experience of supporting the Red Cross, 1 to 10? How satisfied are you? Which is a slightly different question. And then we have questions that we think are important. So like, how much do you trust us to spend your money well? And how much do you feel you know where your money is going to go and that you're going to make a difference? Really simple, 4 questions. And then we might have another question at the end, like I say, that's more relevant to something. It's so easy. There's loads of free survey things out there. You don't need to be a massive analytical expert. Like Sharon can cross-reference different segments and all sorts of malarkey like that. But if I was to do it, I would just be like, this is what they say. And what does it tell us and what does it mean? And therefore, what might we do differently? It's super simple. I think we can overthink surveys and all that jazz. We have one that we send every 2 years, is like 6 pages long. And it's part of a benchmarking thing for the sector. And I hate it because it's all about the Red Cross. It's completely navel gazy. And it's purely just to create a benchmark against, like, I don't know, Oxfam or something. And like, who cares? I shouldn't say that out loud. I do. It's important. It helped me justify investing time and effort and experience because our scores were rubbish. But like, it isn't actually genuinely that helpful for identifying things to fix.
Can I jump in with a very quick one, John? Just I know that we're just a quick, slightly cheeky one, maybe, Lesley. So if you've asked loads of people about what delights them about charities, what does delight people about charities? Like, what is there some, like, what are those really amazing experiences that we can all try to create?
So the stories I would hear often would be when a charity made somebody feel like a human person, like as an individual. They were their stories would be things like, they always remember my name when I go into the charity shop. I made a donation in memory of my mum and they sent me a really lovely personalized message. They surprised them by remembering something about them usually. And also that they recognized the emotion behind a donation, especially if it was like a memory donation or a donation to a medical charity or anything like that. Like, we're really bad at stripping out the emotion of giving. We professionalize the crap out of fundraising to the point that we forget that behind every donation is an emotion, and usually sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's hope, sometimes it's grief, and we forget that. So anytime a charity recognized the emotion behind somebody giving and reflected it back to the person and treated them as a human, that would be the number one thing. The more rational folk, of whom also exist, would be like, I really feel like I know where my money goes. Like, that is so important. But the emotional bit for a lot of people was like, I have a huge amount of emotion because my mum had breast cancer. I gave a big donation to this charity and I feel like they treat me like a number and all they ever do is ask me for more. Like, grief and family, like trauma, treated like a number, not a good combo. Like, and we've proven at the Red Cross last year that you can be emotional and human when writing emails to 120,000 people. It is possible to be emotional and human at scale. And all you have to do is just write like a person. So we had, just super quick, sorry, we had one email that we sent last year. It was Amy was on Teams or whatever to Pally, who's in our email team, and just said, I'm feeling really anxious. I think it was going into the 3rd lockdown, so I'm feeling super anxious. I'm really struggling right now. I really feel for all the people that, like, all of our supporters, because I know how hard this must be. And Pally was like, just write that down and send it to them as an email. And so she did. She literally wrote an email saying, I woke up last night feeling super anxious about the world. And it made me think that you probably all feel that way too. And I just wanted to let you know that we're thinking of you. And here's a link to some mental health support from this brilliant charity called Mind that we really respect. If you're needing any help, I found their mindfulness tool super helpful for me. Thanks, Amy. Nothing to do with the Red Cross at all. to do with them as people. And it was one of the emails that we had the most emails back saying thank you so much. So it is possible. Just be human and emotional within reason, without being weird. But it's okay to like talk to people like humans.
Great. And I guess that's the thing with digital channels that a lot of organizations are seeing now, is like you can use them in a more personal way. You know, it's not like you have to go and get a draft and get it printed and posted and all that. You can try stuff out. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Ooh. We've got to near the end of our time, but we can probably squeeze in one more question if somebody would like one. All looking content. It's been really great, Lesley, to hear from you and all the angles of supporter experience. Loads of really interesting ideas to go away with, as always. So thank you for that. And I've posted a couple of links in chat. We'll email that link to the exclusive Erica Hall Q&A. We've got your email, so we'll share that with you when we share details. Lesley's posted her Twitter details in chat as well, so do be in touch. And thank you all so much. I'm really interested to hear about all that. So the next Digi Shift will be at the end of the month in October, and we'll let you know when we've got our topic and speaker lined up. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks everybody.
See you soon. Bye.
See you, folks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.